and it leads to the following. We'll now cast a vote on the witness question, and once that vote is complete, I would ask that the Senate stand in recess, subject to call of the chair.
Thank you. Without objection, so ordered. The question is, shall it be in order to consider and debate under the impeachment rules any motion to subpoena witnesses or documents? The yeas and nays are required under Senate Resolution 483. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander? No. No. Ms. Baldwin? Aye. Mr. Barrasso?
No.
No. Mr. Bennett? Aye. Mrs. Blackburn? No. Mr. Blumenthal? Mr. Blunt? No. Mr. Booker?
Yes.
Aye. Mr. Bozeman? No. Mr. Braun? No. Mr. Brown? Aye. Mr. Burr? No. Ms. Cantwell? Aye. Mrs. Capito? No. Mr. Cardin? Aye. Mr. Carper? Aye. Mr. Casey? Aye. Mr. Cassidy? No. Ms. Collins? Aye. Mr. Coons? Aye. Mr. Cornyn? No. Ms. Cortez Masto? Aye. Mr. Cotton? No. Mr. Kramer? No. Mr. Crapo? No. Mr. Cruz? No. Mr. Daines? No. Ms. Duckworth? Aye. Mr. Durbin? Aye. Mr. Enzi? No. Ms. Ernst? Mrs. Feinstein? Aye. Ms. Ernst, no. Mrs. Fisher? No. Mr. Gardner? No. Mrs. Gillibrand? Aye. Mr. Graham? No. Mr. Grassley? No. Ms. Harris? Aye. Ms. Hassan? Aye. Mr. Hawley? No. Mr. Heinrich? Aye. Ms. Hirono? Aye. Mr. Hoeven? No. Mrs. Hyde-Smith? No. Mr. Inhofe? No. Mr. Johnson? No. Mr. Jones? Aye. Mr. Kane? Aye. Mr. Kennedy? No. Mr. King? Aye. Ms. Klobuchar? Aye. Mr. Lankford? No. Mr. Leahy? Aye. Mr. Lee? No. Mrs. Loeffler? No. Mr. Manchin? Aye. Mr. Markey? Aye. Mr. McConnell? No. Ms. McSally? No. Mr. Menendez? Aye. Mr. Merkley? Aye. Mr. Moran? No. Ms. Murkowski? No. Mr. Murphy? Aye. Mrs. Murray? Aye. Mr. Paul? No. Mr. Perdue? No. Mr. Peters? Aye. Mr. Portman? No. Mr. Reed? Aye. Mr. Risch? No. Mr. Roberts? No. Mr. Romney? Aye. Ms. Rosen? Aye. Mr. Rounds? No. Mr. Rubio? No. Mr. Sanders? Aye. Mr. Sass? No. Mr. Schatz? Aye. Mr. Schumer? Aye. Mr. Scott of Florida? No. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? No. Mrs. Shaheen? Aye. Mr. Shelby? No. Ms. Sinema? Aye. Ms. Smith? Aye. Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mr. Sullivan? No. Mr. Tester? Aye. Mr. Thune? No. Mr. Tillis? No. Mr. Toomey? No. Mr. Udall? Aye. Mr. Van Hollen? Aye. Mr. Warner? Aye. Ms. Warren? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Mr. Wicker? No. Mr. Wyden? Aye. Mr. Young? No. Mr. Blumenthal? Aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 49. The nays are 51. The motion is not agreed to. Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair.
And you can just hear the murmurs happening there on the Senate floor. We do have, again, that lower third for you, showing you that the yeas, very close call, 49. It did need 51 to pass, and the nays had it, so there will not be witnesses called for this, and the motion was not agreed to. As you can see, Senate on a break, and to look for some news items that we can bring to you while we wait for the Chief Justice to call everyone back. And as you can see, I do have a double box going. We do have a camera out in the hallway in case anyone does step out to comment on the vote that just happened.
Oh, good.
We're going to go by together, okay?
It had no witnesses, no documents. It is a tragedy on a very large scale. I will be now going up to my caucus to discuss what we're doing next. I will not talk about it here. Okay? Thanks.